Yeah, the second album, that's one of the big ones.
Yeah. And Led Zeppelin II, we're definitely talking about a game-changing album here for not only for the band, but just in general for rock music. It's just one of those benchmark albums that everybody points to in this kind of genre of music, in hard rock and heavy metal, the way that Machine Head and things like Paranoid are from Iommi and Blackmore. And this is that kind of album. And it takes what was beginning on the first album, and I think it makes it tighter and more concise. And this album is a little bit more focused, and it's a little less diverse than Led Zeppelin 1, and less diverse than Led Zeppelin III that came after it. So you start off with Whole Lotta Love, and this becomes their signature track, and remains their signature track until you get things like Stairway to Heaven and Kashmir later. And even once you have those tracks later, Whole Lotta Love becomes still the signature track that they would typically close a show with for a long time. And this is another one of those, landmark moments in guitar, and a landmark moment in production, and all of the stuff that's going on this track that isn't the actual composition, but is just studio stuff. The backwards echo we talked about, all the sonic swirls and things. When you first hear this thing on headphones,
Oh man,
it's a landmark moment in panning. It's just in terms of where you're panning the music from one side to the other and going back and forth with specific elements and panning and things like that. So
such a way to open an album with that riff, and then Robert Plant coming in with those incredible vocals, and then in the middle of it you get this psychedelic crazy happening.
Yeah, I mean it's like this psychedelic orgasm thing going on in the middle of it. And this is, if you didn't believe it yet in Dazed and Confused, this is the beginning of cock rock. Right here. This is it. This is songs about sex, amplified to much bigger levels than the early bluesmen would do plenty of songs about sex, right? But this is where you get it amped up. Still a bit of psychedelia, as you say, but it's heavy. It's heavy as hell. The riff is relentless. It's one of Jimmy's best riffs. It's one of his simplest riffs. And by the way, some of your best riffs are usually your simplest riffs. It just works. It became, much to their surprise, they snuck a radio edit out on the band, which was not something that Jimmy Page was ever going to let happen. But there was a radio edit of this thing where they cut it down, and I think they chopped out a good part of the middle of it.
Yeah, they basically cut out the whole psychedelic break, and it goes right into the drum.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And Jimmy had a shit fit. And that was the last time he ever let them get away with anything again. Though they tried. He was adamant they were not going to be a singles band that chased singles. However, I think, what was it, Top of the Pops, I guess, or something like that. They used Whole Lotta Love as their theme song for ages. One of the British shows that played the hits, they would use this song as their theme song for a while. But, I mean, then you have, obviously, after this swirling guitar section and where Robert Plant's having this psychedelic orgasm moment, as you say, it comes back with this immense break and this drum break and this ripping guitar solo. And Jimmy's using a cocked wah, so it sounds particularly piercing.
Yeah.
With this tone that comes in, that is nothing. It's not like the rhythm tone. And when I say, and for people who don't know, you take a wah-wah pedal, and somewhere in the middle there you find this frequency of where the note becomes very nasal and very piercing, and it's a really cool effect to use for a guitar solo. And
it's a mean sound.
Yeah, Michael Schenker is known for this sound, and so is Kirk Hammett, by the way. Using the sound of what they call a cocked wah pedal. And you hear it here, and then you hear this bump, bump, and then phrase one, bump, bump. And yeah, And this sort of call and response structure between the rhythm section and what Jimmy's playing, it's just immensely powerful and really so ballsy. And then of course the drums come back in with a slow snare roll and back come crashing in, and they do the outro. And then they'd stop it again at the end, and you have Robert Plant doing his moment where way down inside, woman, you need... And then he hits the long high note, and he goes up to it, and he sings up to this crescendo. And they just sort of riff out towards the end. It's, like I said, this track is a landmark moment in heavy rock. It's a landmark moment in production. It's a landmark moment in what you can do on a guitar. It's just a really big milestone for Led Zeppelin on a track on an album that is a classic that has, a shitload of good stuff. This is still, I think, the first track that most people think of when they think of Led Zeppelin II. This is the first thing I always think of, even though I know the whole thing very intimately.
Do you think they knew that they were having something very special when they're working on this?
I think they thought once they got the the weird stuff done in the studio, I think they realized that it was taking on a stature that was really cool. If you take out that middle section, with, like I said, I'm calling it the psychedelic orgasm section. If you take that out, it would still probably be strong, but it wouldn't be so epically memorable in the way that it was. Because again, there wasn't anything else like this song coming out at that time. Well,
not everyone gets that part, though.
I understand, and you can make a small case that Zeppelin were somewhat progressive. In they're not prog rock, but I mean they had progressive ideas, and they certainly had and Jimmy certainly had progressive ideas in the studio, and this is a continuation of things like the Beatles using the studio as an instrument, right? For the people who always thought that George Martin was in effect the fifth Beatle because he was the guy who made the studio so much a part of what the Beatles achieved in their sonics and in their songs. You can say the same thing here, is that, Jimmy Page is using the studio here as another instrument. This takes it from being more than just a four-piece band. There's something more going on here. So, second song is What Is and What Should Never Be, which we talked about this a little earlier too when we were talking about his slide style and things like that. This is if you will, a laid-back Led Zeppelin rock track that is not an acoustic track, really. But it's got a completely different mood than the normal bombastic mood. This is sort of, it doesn't mean it doesn't have its moments of bombast, but it's a quieter song in its intro and its build up to the chorus. And then the chorus, when the chorus hits, it's pretty loud and bombastic, but then it comes back down. So we're working with dynamics here that are, pretty dramatic and, from one extreme to another, if you will, from a very quiet intro part to Robert Plant pushing pretty hard in the choruses. The cool thing on this is some of Jimmy's slide playing in the solo. It's just so understated, but so full of attitude and so full of mood. He starts off, again, this is a very quiet sort of mood compared to ripping like you heard on Whole Lotta Love. And it's a slide guitar solo where at the beginning he's just playing this melody.
With a lot of echo too.
Yeah, there's plenty of echo on the thing. And it's a single note, for the most part, melody he's playing on slide. And then when the chord change comes, he kind of goes into these Elmore James-like slides, which are a little bit louder. And then at the end, he goes back to a melodic phrase. And then on the last note, he just slides the thing all the way down the neck. And he takes so much time and lays back, and nothing is rushed. Everything is really, really laid back in a really cool way. We talk about, playing behind the beat and things like that. This solo is just masterful in its attitude and composition and rhythmic feel. And that last note, he just slides it out and lets the echo do the heavy lifting at the tail end of it. It's a really cool track. Then we go straight back to Cock Rock, the Lemon Song, another landmark Cock Rock album moment.
And there's also this back and forth between Robert Plant and the guitar at one point.
Well, yeah, I mean, it is sort of call and response. And here we have Robert Plant basically, again, I think he's referencing Albert King's Killing Floor in the vocals.
Yeah.
So, but beyond that, it's like this music is very much of Jimmy Page, very much of John Bonham. And by the way, an unsung hero on this track, we'll talk about it as we get into it later, is John Paul Jones's bass work when in the mid section when it's quiet, and John Paul Jones is like just playing this amazing walking bass, keeping the whole track moving. But I mean, this is a great Jimmy Page riff. This is a blues structure. Clearly, it's it has its roots in 1-4-5, and it's a blues structure. And Robert Plant is singing the shit out of this one, and we're getting into the lemon squeezing area at this point. And Robert was well known to be wearing very tight pants on stage so that you could see his lemon. And this is an epically good song. It's long. It's got it all. This is a underrated, if you will, Led Zeppelin track in my opinion. I always loved this one. And we have this slow, draggy riff, and then a turnaround that sort of ups the tempo for a while, and then it drops down, and they have a midsection, kind of like a breakdown, and it's Robert Plant bellowing out these lyrics while John Paul Jones is playing really great bass underneath, and some really good solos by Jimmy Page, and of course Bonham is excellent throughout. But this is a big bombastic cock rock moment.
This was also one of those songs they really dragged out during concerts, right?
They didn't play this one as much as I would have thought they would have. I don't know why that is, but I don't recall hearing a ton of live versions of this on bootlegs or on official releases. I'm not saying they never did, because I can't tell you if they ever did or didn't. But it wasn't one of the staples of their live set, like Dazed and Confused was, like Whole Lotta Love was. It was never one of the ones that stayed in from tour to tour.
All right.
They may have played, like I said. I think on the tour of whatever album they were touring, they were likely to play some of these tracks. But I think at a certain point they had so much material, stuff had to just be prioritized, and maybe they didn't prioritize this one. And then we move on to Thank You, which is a lovely track. So this is, if you will, a ballad. It's not a rocker. It's a tribute to Robert Plant's wife at the time, and it's a more gentle, tender song. Yes, John Bonham kicks in with a great beat and all of that, but you can tell even with Bonham, he's holding back. He's not bashing here. He's being an accompanist here. He's treating the song with the respect of what it's trying to be, rather than pushing it beyond that and trying to make it into something bombastic. This isn't that. This is a ballad, and this they would do from time to time, and they would bring this back over the years, and they would bring this back in the Page Plant years, and I know Robert Plant would sometimes do this song in concert when he was a solo act. So I think it's still very important to Robert. It's another classic Zeppelin track, but with a different flavor.
And then we get Heartbreaker, which is a very hard-hitting song.
Yeah, everybody's full out on this one, and we talked about this being a landmark Guitar Hero moment, because in the middle of this song, again, we have, before you get to the middle of the song, you have a great riff.
Yeah.
Right? And again, this is, its roots are in another bluesy structure, but It's much more of a rocker, and they would stretch this one out live a little bit too, and Jimmy would take the solo. So in the middle of the song, it reaches a crescendo and it stops. And Jimmy Page takes a freestyle guitar solo in the middle of this song. And, think about just like, where does that come from? It's not like a self-contained thing like when Eddie did Eruption. It's in the middle of a song, and there's no accompaniment. He just goes off and takes this thing. And then the band comes back in for the rest of the song, and he plays a second guitar solo, which in my opinion has always even been a tastier solo than the first one. But a lot of this is about Robert Plant too, and he's just wonderful on this stuff, really selling it. And the quality of his voice is very pushed to its limits and believable. He's selling it, if you will.
Sounds like a pterodactyl.
Yeah.
And then the next track is Livin' Lovin' Maid. She's just a woman.
Yeah, and if there's any track on this album that I would consider filler, this would be it. It's still a really good song, but it's just surrounded by much better songs, in my opinion. This is sort of like, it couldn't have taken them very long to write this one. It's a nice riff, and it's one of those things that when you're first starting out as a player on guitar or bass, one of the first Zeppelin songs a lot of people learn is this one, because it's got one of those accessible riffs that's fun to play and not particularly challenging to play. But it's a good song, and much like Communication Breakdown, it's much more of that up-tempo. This one's not quite as punky as Communication Breakdown, but it's an up-tempo 2 minutes 39 seconds as opposed to 6 minutes and 20 of the Lemon song.
It sounds more like a pop song than a hard rock song compared to.
It is. I mean, you could almost say this would, if they had wanted a single, this might have been a contender. Back in the days when you wanted your single to be under 3 minutes long. But I mean, they had this song. It's, like I said, it's not a bad song. It's just not quite as good as the rest of this stuff, I think. And then we get Ramble On, which again is another classic.
It's really, really good.
Yeah, and
I love this one.
This is another one of those ones where Jimmy's blending acoustic guitar with electric guitar really, really well. And, he's creating this dynamic contrast between the acoustic sound and the electric sound, and the quiet part and the heavy part, and the light and shade, the Led and the Zeppelin. So this one did remain a live track for a long time. They would do this one live. And this is just another one of those tracks that everybody knows from Zeppelin. It's just...
Lyrics were influenced by The Lord of the Rings by J.J.R. Tolkien, by the way.
Right.
They're mentioning the Dark Land of Mordor, Gollum, and the Evil One.
Right. He's definitely... He had just read Lord of the Rings, and it was big thing.
There's also the violin-like sound there by using a neck pickup on his Les Paul and with the
treble
cut.
He does the guitar solo. He's harmonizing with himself. So the rhythm starts out, and I think it's Bonzo's playing some sort of acoustic drum like a conga or something with his hands. And later on he kicks into the kick when the song gets bigger and bombastic. But again, this is like quiet, loud, and in the quiet parts he's playing this part. He's not using sticks. It sounds like he's playing with his hands. And the guitar solo is an interesting melodic idea where Jimmy's playing a melody that he harmonizes with himself over two guitars, and it creates a nice effect. Ramble On's great.
And then we got Moby Dick, and I really like that one.
It's funny. I'm not a big fan of drum solos personally, and putting them on a studio album, that's sort of a ballsy move. But when you have John Bonham, there's that.
I love drum solos.
Yeah, I know. A lot of people do. It's just never been my thing. But the riff in Moby Dick, the guitar riff, is really cool. It's in drop D. We talked a little bit about that, and it's really just to set up. You go around once or twice. just to set up this drum solo in the middle of the thing for John Bonham to do a very abbreviated version of what he would do live. But you do get to hear
20 minutes, right?
Yeah, and here it's shrunk down to 4 minutes and 21 seconds, and he has to just give you a piece of this and a piece of that. But you do hear him do the thing where he's playing with his hands, and instead of playing with drumsticks, there's a part of that there, and then you hear him doing some of the snare drum effects things where he would push in on the drum head and make the thing sort of change pitch and stuff. Lots of interesting stuff there. It's John Bonham. He's a legend, god. Probably the greatest drummer ever lived in rock anyway. And then they come back and they finish it off with the riff. And it's just, like I said, it's sort of a signature piece for what they would do to set up John Bonham for his solo live.
I think it's so cool when they come back in after John Bonham does his thing. I just love that.
To me, the coolest thing about Moby Dick, much as I love John Bonham's playing, is that guitar riff. It's a nasty riff. I mean, it's a shame that it's only being used to set him up for a drum solo in some respects. I always thought that riff had more potential than just to be an instrumental lead into a drum solo. But
there's also some cool guitar stuff going on there.
Yeah, he does his little fills. They give him basically 4 little spaces to do some quick licks. It's a quick thing. It's you can't imagine that they spent much time developing that. That's one of those things where I think that probably came together fairly fast. And then the album closes with Bring It On Home, which to me has always been sort of an underrated track. In my mind, I love this track. Again, we have an underlying blues structure in the guitar arrangement, but it's a really interesting guitar arrangement. And there's a riff that starts it off, and they started off very quiet and slow, like a very old blues number with Robert Plant singing like an old blues man through some sort of filter on his voice. And he's using, an affected voice that isn't like his normal singing voice. He's mimicking like the sound, the way an old blues man might sing, rather than the way Robert Plant typically sings on something like Lemon Song. And then it gets into this thing where you get this great guitar riff, and then it goes into this much faster, heavier, bluesy... Is this a shuffle, really? I don't know. Not really a shuffle, but it's an interesting guitar figure that Jimmy's playing in the riffs here, and it's very effective. And then, of course, at the end, they bring it back down to the way it sort of started, and they let it finish the way it started with a, like this... It's back to this old blues kind of style of just... I don't know what you would call it.
Like Delta blues, old blues, like
yeah, like sort of like this Delta blues feel, this old blues style, with a rock blues in the middle,
right?
And a great guitar riff, that isn't a typical blues riff.
It's another Willie Dixon song.
Yeah, and here's a perfect example of like how Robert Plant would get them into trouble, because if you take away the beginning and the end of this song and you just listen to the midsection where it's Jimmy Page going da 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 da, and the way he is playing under the verse riff, that has nothing to do with the Willie Dixon version of this song. And musically, you would say, okay, if you'd never heard Robert Plant sing Willie Dixon lyrics over this, they would have probably not run afoul of anything legal. And this was always the problem when they got into trouble, where, like, Jimmy would write parts that are Jimmy's parts. They're not Willie Dixon's parts. And because the lyrics are being used, there are Willie Dixon lyrics, then you have a problem. But it's a great song, a great way to finish the album. And Led Zeppelin II really upped the game for them. And by the way, they made this album here and there on the road. As they went out to slog the first album and tour the first album, they would take a few days off and run into Olympic or run in somewhere else, some other studio, and they'd cut a track. And they every track was a couple of tracks were recorded here, a couple of tracks were recorded there. It was really make this album in our spare moments while we're on tour.
Yeah, they recorded in two different. They recorded in Olympic and Morgan Studios in London, England.
Mm-hmm.
A&M Quantum, Sunset, Mirror Sound, Mystic Studios, Los Angeles.
Yeah, I was going to say, wasn't some of it in L.A.? Yeah.
Yeah, Ardent Studios in Memphis, Tennessee, A&R. Like I think they use like 10 different studios or something.
Yeah, and the fact that it sounds cohesive is amazing, because in those days you went to a different studio, you got a different sound.
Yeah.
Even if you're bringing your same gear in and stuff like that, and especially a band that was like Zeppelin, where they were trying to capture the sound of the live room. Every studio's live room sounds different.
Yeah.
So it's amazing that this from song to song, it sounds as cohesive. If you didn't know that, you wouldn't have guessed that this wasn't made all in one place in one session, right? It doesn't sound like it's sonically jumping all over the place.
Production was entirely credited to Jimmy Page, with Eddie Kramer engineering. He later said the famous Whole Lotta Love mix, where everything is going bananas, is a combination of Jimmy and myself just flying around on a small console, twiddling every knob known to man. Kramer later gave credit to Page for the sound that was achieved despite the inconsistent conditions in which it was recorded. Yeah.
Yeah.
They recorded some of the tracks in the most bizarre studios you can imagine, but in the end it sounded bloody marvelous, mate.
Yeah.
There was one guy in charge, and that was Mr. Page.
Yeah, and he knew what he wanted, and this is, again, that creative vision that we're talking about. Whether it's Jimmy Page saying, I want this section that I can't describe to you in the middle of a Whole Lotta Love. Queen had the same thing with Freddie Mercury and Bohemian Rhapsody. That, like, when he was trying to describe to the band what Bohemian Rhapsody was like in his head, they didn't get it until he started tracking that middle section himself. So you have this guy who's got this vision in his head of what this thing should sound like, and the rest of the band just has to trust that, Jimmy has a vision, Freddie has a vision, whoever it is has this vision, and he's earned enough credit that we should trust him and just see where it goes. And, that's what makes some of these acts so much more special than pretty much all the ones that follow. But Led Zeppelin, like I said, Led Zeppelin II really cemented their reputation as the hard rock band of that time. They were the new kings with this album. They were upstarts with Led Zeppelin I in some ways. And Led Zeppelin I, they were still sort of opening for like Vanilla Fudge and things like that on the road. When Zeppelin II hits and when Whole Lotta Love hits, they become headliners. They become the band that they've arrived essentially at this point, and nothing would ever be the same because of this album and because of the impact of this album and the expectations that it set up for future albums. So what happens now is they've been going at it solidly since. Now, don't forget, I believe this comes out the same year as Zeppelin 1.
Let's see.
This is not even a year later.
You were right. Led Zeppelin 1 and 2 both came out in 1969. Led Zeppelin 3 came out in 1970. Wow.
Yeah. So they're working at a breakneck pace. From the time they get their record deal and go on the road to promote Led Zeppelin 1, they're in this absolutely creative crucible where this stuff is coming. They're touring Led Zeppelin 1, and this is the kind of songwriting that's coming out in their spare moments. So this band is taking off like a rocket at this point, both creatively and success-wise. And
they were still like really young when they were doing this.
Yeah. Page is like 25, and Bonzo and Plant are like 20. 21 maybe, something like that.
It's crazy.
Yeah, and so they're absolutely on the up and on this creative juggernaut where being together, playing together live, the ideas that are coming up with each other, that they're coming up with each other, are getting stronger and stronger, frankly. This is a stronger set of songs in many ways than the first album. And they're touring constantly, and they don't have a break. And eventually, they have enough clout because of the success and because of the kind of deal they signed to say, after Led Zeppelin II, they're going to take a break. Not a big break.
During the recording of Led Zeppelin II, was there already a lot of drugs and drink going on, or were they still kind of, yeah?
I mean, there may be a little bit, but certainly not what it was about to become. I'm sure there was plenty of marijuana. I'm sure there was plenty of drink. There was probably the beginnings of cocaine, certainly, I would think. There's no heroin here yet. Not really.
Okay.
Not that I can recall. So, yeah, they've released 2 albums in a few months apart. It's not even one album one year, one album the next.
2 brilliant albums, too.
Right. And they would release their 3rd album in 1970, so they will have released, at that point, 3 albums in about 2 years, maybe. Less than 2 years.